Augur Void Station, JUF-D19, Rimward, Darkan System. They were all going to die. Augur Station Vox Primary Ancum had admitted as much before the station's commander, Sensorium Master Crassus, had ordered him to be silent. None of them needed the Vox Primary's analysis to know what was about to happen. Augur Analyst Davrik's main view screen had just come back online. It had shorted out 3 times in the last hour, overloaded by the sheer weight of returns it was getting from the Augur arrays that monitored the edge of the Darkan system. The counter for his sector had stalled at 1,314, and was simply blinking on and off, its red digits throwing Davrik's face into light and dark. Light and dark. The displays all around him were now a morass of unidentified organic returns, rendered all but useless by the weight of data appearing across the screens. Augur Station JUF-D19 Rimward's processors were unable to comprehend the sheer size of Hive Fleet Cicatrix as it arrived in system. Tech Adept Groll seemed to have gone into some sort of standby, cortical plug still linking him to the Deep Space Station's drives. He sat bound in his binary communion chair, eyes glazed, pale lips quivering. Crassus had given up trying to bring him back online. Estimated time to contact? The Sensorium Master asked, voice hoarse. He was watching the external pict screens. Unknown. Another of the Void Station's 6-man crew, Serene, responded. My systems are all glitched, but running off the last speed and trajectory readings we managed to file, I estimate no more than 10 minutes. Nobody replied. Everyone's eyes were on the pict feed. The external recordings had managed to pick out their doom. The view of real space in the station's immediate vicinity was a grainy, static-washed green, but the resolution was enough to make out the thing approaching them through the void. The Augur's systems had been constructed to collate and analyze non-visual data. Such clinical information was of far more use than the scant things that could be detected through the naked eye, watching view screen images of distant objects. In a twist of cruel irony, JUF-D19 Rimward's grainy old pic recorders were the only pieces of data collection equipment not overloaded by the sheer size of the Xenos fleet. Now that fleet's vanguard was visible. Something was nearing the station, drawing towards it with a silent, eerie inevitability. Its form defied easy definition. Davrik, born to a middle-ranking Ashhiver family on Calaris Prime, had never seen the ocean before, but he'd witnessed the strange, frilled creatures imported as foodstuffs for Calaris' teeming hab blocks from harvest worlds like Aquim and New Haven. The thing approaching JUF-D19 Rimward looked like one such creature, albeit far larger, and cast out into the void. Its back was a gnarled, curling hump of scarred bone plating, while its underside was a mass of dozens of limb-like tendrils that waved back and forth with a lazy synchronization, as though powering it forward through the depths. Streamers of void-frozen fluid clung to its fronds, while its head constituted nothing more than a fleshy maw. Orifices in its spine shell occasionally gouted bursts of bioeffluvium that crystallized in the void. Vanguard organism, Analyst Corday said, as though to break the awful silence that had fallen over the station. No specific class or designation. Estimated time to contact less than 5 minutes, Serene added quietly. We're about to be boarded, or God Emperor knows what else, Crassus snapped, trying to wake up his stunned crew. I want everything wiped. Now. Follow your damn protocols. The icy, expectant stillness that had settled over the station dissipated as they all hurried to comply. Davrik began to wipe his core cogitators and processor units, inserting a series of codes that were authorized by Crassus's gene stamp. The hurried activity helped draw his mind away from the cold sweat slicking his body, the throbbing in his skull, and the base, panic-stoked fear churning in his stomach. "Systems are beginning to go offline," he confirmed. "Critical's multiplying, Chief." Crassus didn't respond. He was too busy giving authorization to Ancom to scramble the Vox systems. Serene was wiping data slates, while Corday was dumping sheaves of paperback copies and data readout chits into the vacuum chute. Only Grohl was motionless, still staring into nothing. "Tech Adept, respond," Crassus said, turning his attention to the Adeptus Mechanicus acolyte. The coghead remained unmoving. "Maximum priority response override," Crassus snapped. "Look at me, Grohl." The adept blinked once, slowly. "He's gone, Chief," Corday said, glancing over from the chute. "You've got to unplug him from the data frame." For a moment, Crassus looked as though he was going to reply. Then, instead, he reached down to the base of the Adept's mem unit, sutured into the pale flesh at the base of his skull. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled. There was an instant of resistance. Then the unit disengaged with a click. Grohl didn't react, though a line of saliva escaped his sagging lips. Crassus reached up to the heavy cortical plug inserted into Grohl's cranium, near the surgery-scarred crown of his white scalp. "God, Emperor, forgive me," the Sensorum Master muttered, before yanking the plug free. Systems across the station's remaining displays began to chime and flash, as though the machine spirits were calling out in shock. Grohl spasmed violently for a moment, held in check by his binary chair's restraints, then slumped back. A single hand continued to twitch and clench. "Eyes on your stations," Crassus ordered, though the surety in his voice was gone. "Contact," Serene said. The void monster filled the picked screen. Up close, its form was even more nightmarish. Davrik could see the spine growths that lined its motion frills, and the scarring on its curled shell where debris had lashed it during its long voyage between the stars. As the station crew watched, its maw distended, pulling apart. Contrary to Davrik's horrified imaginings, it did not possess row after row of snapping lock teeth. Instead, its mouth was a fleshy morass of feelers, disgusting tendrils trailing icy slime. They extended as it came blindly upon the station, reaching out past the pick screen's pan. A proximity alarm bell started to clatter, and Davrik felt the decking beneath him shudder. It's going to eat us," Ancom stammered, looking as though he was about to be sick. "Oh, Throne, it's..." "Silence," Crassus snapped, though he too was visibly shaking. More tendrils reached ponderously out, questing around the station's flanks. Secondary alarms activated, and the adamantium around the crew shuddered and groaned. Was it going to crush them, tear them open and expose them to the void, suck them into the vile, drooling orifice now practically pressed up against the pick display? Davrik found himself staring at the terrified image, unable to shift away from his workbench, unable to look at anything other than the unnatural, pulsating flesh that now filled the screen. And then it shifted. The screen blurred, lost for a moment to static. For a second, Davrik assumed one of the monster's tendrils had knocked out the external pict feed. But when the view screen came back online, the image was still present. What was more, the maw was receding. The Xenos beast was reversing away from them. The station shuddered again as the tendrils that had latched around it released their snaggle-toothed grip, sliding back into the monster's depths as its maw constricted. It pulled away from them, and then went upwards, displaying its fleshy lower fronds as it slipped over the auger masts and Vox beacons. The picked feed on the other side of the station caught its trailing rear as it passed back down the other side, floating on in-system past the little monitoring platform. For a moment, nobody spoke. Davrik, like the others, simply stared after the Xenos creature's languid, receding form. It was Crassus who snapped them out of it. "Turn off those damned alarms," he ordered. Corday hit the overrides, one after the other. Silence flooded the space left by the clattering emergency systems. Even the hum of the cogitators and vox banks, now deactivated, had gone. Davrik had never heard the little station so silent before. "What do we do now?" Serene breathed. All eyes turned to Crassus. With what was clearly an immense effort, the old Sensorum master stilled his shaking hands. The ugly emergency lighting made him look even more wizened and gaunt than usual. "We wait," he said. "There's nothing else we can do. The distress beacon is still transmitting. One of the system defense cutters will pick us up." It was a lie, and they all knew it. A vast Xenos threat had just arrived in system. The last considerations for the captains of Darkan's handful of combat-worthy voidcraft would be the salvation of the Augur stations on the system's fringes. Nor were there any shuttles or salvation pods to facilitate an evacuation. The crew were delivered to the station and then, after 6 months, rotated off for a week's leave. According to the cycle logs, there was a full Terran month to go before they were to be replaced. There was no way for any of them to abandon the station. "Why did it leave us?" Corday wondered out loud, staring after the receding alien bioship. "It had us." "We were no threat to it," Crassus said slowly. "No threat to its fleet." "Chief," Serene interrupted. "Chief, look." The Augur analyst was pointing back at the pict screens. It took a second for Davrik to realize what he was looking at. When he did, the reason for their survival became clear. The Vanguard Xenos bioships had passed by. JUF-D19 Rimward was now at the heart of their fleet. And, compared to the organic drones that quested ahead of the main swarm, the true organisms of the Hive Fleet were behemoths. Davrik's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing, as he took in sheets of pock-marked chitin the size of small continents, and toothed orifices the size of cities. The thick clusters of tendrils along its flank and underbelly writhed in the solar winds, while its maw was encompassed by 2 great, wicked, beak-like bone plates that looked as though they could have sheared an Imperial capital ship in half. And the worst thing about the nightmarish Leviathan was that it was coming straight towards the Augur station. "Oh, God, Emperor," Ancum stammered, over and over. Corday was quietly sobbing, his head in his hands. Serene just stared, the image on the view screen reflected in her wide, dark eyes. Only Crassus turned away from the display. He walked over to the worn leather of his command chair, paused, tugged his dark blue Sensorum Master's uniform straight, and sat down. His expression was unreadable, jaw locked, though in the harsh emergency lumens he looked more haggard than ever. "Crew members," he said, his words cutting through Ancum's and Corday's despair. "In the past decades of service, it shames me to admit that I have not said this enough. Regardless, if there was ever a time, Throne knows it's now. It has been an honor to man this station with all of you." "And with you, Chief," Davrik said. He was the only one to respond. His own words felt distant, disconnected, as though he was speaking to himself from somewhere far away. His mind was sluggish, unresponsive. His breathing felt labored. A strange, detached part of his mind supposed that he was probably having a panic attack. Crassus had no more orders to give. He simply sat, watching the view screen. Davrik reached out towards his little picked capture of Emilia and Drui, his wife and son, tacked to the side of his monitor. He would see them again, someday, He was sure of it. A fresh surge of stuttered oaths from Ankum distracted him before he could pull the pict off the side of the display. The Tyranid bioship had filled the view screens. Even as the stunned crew watched, the monstrosity's great, hooked chitin beak split apart. The maw yawned wide. Impossibly wide. Wide enough, Davrik was sure, to swallow one of Darkan's moons. Its shadow fell across the Augur station, blotting out the light of the stars. The structure around them seemed to shudder, as though its terror matched that of its crew. The view screen now showed nothing but static washed darkness. It had swallowed them whole. Corday had slumped on the deck, shaking and weeping uncontrollably. Crassus was looking down into his lap, knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. Ankum had finally stopped gibbering. "Serene," he managed to say, looking over at the Augur analyst. "Serene, there's something I need to tell you." She continued to stare at the now blank view screen. A sudden impact threw them all. Davrik found himself sprawling across the deck, almost on top of Corday. The station shook violently, tremors dislodging rune banks and audio systems, and sending Davrik's empty recaf tin bouncing across the deck. The alarms triggered again across the cramped station. Crassus, who alone had managed to stay in his seat, deactivated them without comment. The view screen had gone offline completely, showing nothing but grey static. They're going to board us," Ankum stammered as they picked themselves up. Any response was lost in another jarring impact. The station's frame shrieked in protest at the stresses put upon it. With their systems scrambled and broken, it was impossible to tell exactly where they were, or what was happening outside. The station seemed to settle slightly, the sounds of tortured metal reduced to a low creak. They all scanned the ceiling, looking for any sign of a breach. "Do you hear that?" Serene said. It was the first time she'd spoken since seeing the bioship. They all listened, breath held, straining to hear over the groan of adamantium and Corday's muted sobs. Eventually, Davrik caught what Serene had detected, a faint scratching, scrabbling noise, as though someone or something was scraping across the outside of the hull. It mirrored the scratching, tormenting all of them from inside their own skulls. "They're on the hull," Davrik said. Before he could go on, a crash shattered the breathless quiet. The section directly above Crassus's chair, in the center of the station's cockpit, collapsed. With it came a flood of broiling green liquid that struck Crassus just as he looked up. If the old Sensorum master managed to draw breath to scream, the bioacid flooded his mouth, throat, and lungs before he could make a sound. Davrik caught an impression of his death as he was lost entirely in the torrent. Flesh sloughing from bones, organics consumed in a heartbeat. The rest of the crew recoiled, but too slowly. Serene, nearest to the center of the cockpit, was struck by the acidic spray. Her hands went up to her exposed face, and her screaming filled the claustrophobic space. "No!" Ankum wailed, lunging across his bench to catch the Augur analyst as she collapsed. He managed to drag her hands away from her face, then recoiled. Her features had already been reduced to pockmarked bone, her eyeballs running like liquid from their sockets, meat and tendon slipping away with her fingers. Still, she screamed. Ankum doubled over and was sick. Davrik, whose station was furthest from Crassus's chair, scrambled back on top of his bench as the flood of acid spread across the decking plates. Serene had collapsed into the rising swill, her body coming apart. Ankum tried to push himself against his vox banks, but was sick again and collapsed. The bugs got to him before the acid. There were insects in the hissing, steaming slime, writhing, sightless maggot things with hard black shells. They swarmed from the discolored vomit-like biomatter, the air full of the susurration of their passing as they swiftly covered the deck, and then the cogitator stations, workbenches, and walls, riding the rising tide of acid. First hundreds, and then thousands of them reached Ankum, swarming over his boots and knees and up his arms where he was crouched against the Vox systems. He tried to scream, but choked on his own bile. His eyes rolled back into their sockets as the alien swarm began eating him alive. Corday killed himself. Face still streaked with tears, he leapt directly from his bench into the stream that had consumed Crassus and his command chair. He was gone in an instant, as the breach in the station hull was burned wider. As Ankum's eaten-out remains collapsed into the bioorganics sloshing about the cockpit's deck, Davrik stood rooted to the top of his bench. He couldn't think, couldn't move. He was in the throes of panic. A part of him realized he should end it quickly like Corday. But another part was desperate for another way out. Any way out that avoided the nightmare bile that was burning away everything. It was digesting them whole. Even as the terror kept him in place, Grohl's binary chair collapsed, pitching the unresponsive tech adept into the effluvium. His red cloak billowed for a moment before he was lost, coming apart amidst the steaming clouds of liquefied organics. For a moment, Davrik was alone. For a single ludicrous second, everything felt surreal, ridiculous, almost calm. It had to be a nightmare. None of this horror could possibly be real. Then his bench collapsed.
God, Emperor, no!
He screamed, trying to scramble back onto the plastile's disintegrating remains.
No! No!
The bioacid caught him, sloshing around his boots and his lower fatigues. His panicked wails quickly turned to screams of agony as the material was eaten away, exposing flesh that in turn began to slough off. Muscle and sinew became grey organic paste that revealed bone that gave way and splintered beneath its own acid-gnawed weight. Davrik died slowly, on his knees, eaten up inch by the bile and the sightless burrowing things that swam in it. Eventually the insects flooded his raw throat, choking and suffocating him as they ate out his eyes and bored through his nose and ears and into his brain. The acid took what remained. As another section of the hull caved to emit a fresh gout of vicious toxins, the picture of Amelia and Drewy fell from the side of Davrik's primary view screen into the flood. In an instant, the smiling wife and son were gone, consumed entirely.